All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sonia Fan, the Associate Executive Officer of NTNU's Resource Center for English as a Medium of Instruction. It's a pleasure to have you join us for today's talk, organized by RCEMI. Our center is here to offer tailored support and consultation services to schools and instructors embarking on EMI courses. We're dedicated to empowering educators through a range of professional development opportunities, including courses, workshops, and seminars. Moreover, we've initiated training programs for EMI teaching assistants, aiming to broaden the pool of qualified students who can support EMI classes. We're deeply honored to engage a collaborative effort with American Institute Taiwan to facilitate professional development training courses for educators. Our sincere appreciation extends to AIT for their invaluable support and assistance, whether in delivering advanced training programs such as English as Medium of Instruction or introductory courses like How to EMI. Special thanks also go to Jenny King for her coordination. We're delighted by the enthusiastic participation of numerous educators in this professional development training. Furthermore, we're honored to have Dr. Joseph Siegel as our guest speaker, delivering a course tailored to address the capacity building needs of EMI educators. Through the upcoming series of How to EMI talks, we aim to address teachers' needs by providing practical skills that can be readily applied in their teaching practice. We hope that all educators will benefit greatly from these offerings. Subsequently, I would like to extend an invitation to John Doe, currently serving as the Cultural Affairs Officer at the American Institute Taiwan, to deliver a welcoming address. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Fan. Esteemed participants, good morning, Dr. Siegel. I'm pleased to be with you all here today at this EMI workshop arranged by our dedicated colleagues at NTNU. My name is John Dow, and I am, as Sonia said, the Cultural Affairs Officer from the American Institute in Taiwan. It's been an honor and a pleasure to collaborate with many universities and institutions across Taiwan on our English language training programs, and I'm particularly excited today. We've worked with Shida and TNU for many years, and we even have an English language fellow, Ramon Mislang, assigned there to the Department of English. However, this is the first time we are working with NTNU's Resource Center for EMI. So I'm very happy to briefly introduce Dr. Joseph Siegel. He has worked in Taiwan before. He was our English language specialist last year at the National Taipei University. That virtual project was similar to today's, with topics on EMI and participants being tertiary educators. He's based in Stockholm, Sweden, and he is an expert with research subjects specifically focusing on English as a medium of instruction. Having lived and taught in Japan for many years, he has significant understanding of cultural and educational contexts here in our region. His workshops were so positively productive that we immediately thought of him when Dr. Fan approached us about this new project. And we want to thank Dr. Siegel for saying yes. We know that you all will be in good hands today with him. And also thank you, Dr. Fan and Shida and TNU for this opportunity to continue to contribute to Taiwan's tertiary education. To our participants today, I express my admiration. You come from all parts of Taiwan, and there are so many of you. We know that change is not always easy, but what you are trying to do is remarkable. EMI is a relatively new endeavor, and the balancing act between language and content is no easy task. It's not easy for teachers, and it's not easy for students. Even so, you are willing to take the extra time to learn new methodologies, new tools, and other teaching skills to help your students succeed. I can say that we're all in this together. AIT and Taiwan launched the U.S.-Taiwan Education Initiative in 2020, and our public diplomacy section has done more than a dozen projects on EMI for universities across the island. We remain as committed as ever to support Taiwan's journey down the road to bilingual education. So let's keep collaborating, sharing ideas, and supporting each other. Like I said, we're all in this together. Thank you.
Now let's welcome Dr. Siegel for today's session.
Yes, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to you, and I guess I would say good morning to myself with our time difference from Sweden. So I'm very happy to be here. Thanks very much for the introduction and the welcome. This is a great and exciting opportunity for me. As was mentioned, I've visited Taiwan virtually last year as an English language specialist, but I have also been to Taiwan in person. So great to see you, and a very warm welcome. I think we've got about 2 hours in front of us for today. So I'm going to share my screen with some slides to get us started. I hope that sounds okay to everyone. So I trust that now you can see an opening slide that says U.S. State Department English Language Programs, the how-to series on EMI. And if you're not able to see that slide, please let us know so that from the technology side, we can make sure that you see what I and the organizing committee hope that you can see. So we're here for the how-to series on EMI. And I'm sure that by now you've picked up that EMI is an abbreviation for English Medium Instruction. That's one of the abbreviations that we'll be using today and throughout the lecture series, but there certainly will be more abbreviations, EMI being the most important for us and for our purposes. And during the course of the series, I hope that we have a chance to talk about EMI at a few different levels. At the broad international level, as an international movement in higher education. We'll talk about EMI at a regional level, thinking about contexts like Asia in general, compared to EMI in Europe in general, and talk about the situation in Taiwan specifically. We're meeting, as you know, on Google Meet, and we hope to use some of the interactive features that Google Meet offers us. There are times when I hope to get your reactions in the chat function, from the polls, your reactions. Having your camera on is helpful, but off is certainly okay. And a note from my side that I'm not a Google Meets pro and not so proficient with switching between the different functions here. So just a warning that I might need a moment or two to coordinate things, just because of the technology. What I hope we can use in terms of interactions through Google Meets, both today and in future sessions, are the polls, the chats, and the breakout rooms to a lesser extent. There will be some one-way lecturing where I'd like to share some views, some background on EMI, and also try to stimulate your thinking about what some of these concepts might mean for teaching in EMI at your institution, within your subject or your department, your discipline, and also for you personally as individual teachers. Even though you can see the slide says one-way lecturing, you're certainly welcome to interrupt with questions, with comments. You're certainly welcome to do so. I do a lot of work on EMI teacher development, and so I'd like to try to draw on this session and the others in the series to help add to my work on EMI teacher research and EMI policy development. And that's one reason why I hope to use the polling function. When you respond to a poll, it will be anonymous. Your name won't be attached to your response. But I'd hope to use those responses in research to get a better understanding of what EMI teachers are experiencing in Taiwan. And as noted earlier, the session is being recorded for developmental purposes and also perhaps to capture some of the content for research purposes. Since we're doing this lecture as part of the English language programs, this is a statement of consent related to photographic images and audio, that by attending the event, your image may be captured and it will be used, it may be used for promotional reasons, just to make sure everyone's aware of that. So now we have some of the formalities out of the way. So I'd like to tell you a bit more about myself, and as John Doe had introduced me a bit, you've got some idea of who I am. Maybe by this point, you've guessed by my accent that I'm American. I grew up in the US. Then I spent about 15 years teaching and researching in Japan. Then after a little midlife crisis in Japan, I moved to Sweden, where I've been for about 7 years. And I think this geographic background helps me appreciate the differences in how education works in different places. And so I have an understanding, and not a complete understanding, but a developing understanding of the tasks that teachers face. And I try to pay attention to different student populations, notice different curriculum documents, different institutional policies. So between my educational background in these three places, it's certainly something that I pay close attention to. I'm a professor of English at Stockholm University with mainly a pedagogic focus. I've done academic projects on language education on 6 continents. And I'll let you guess which continent is not included there. And I've published research on topics like EMI lecturing, student note-taking, student experiences, and so on. I also have a multilingual family where my 2 kids use Swedish as their native language, even though one was born in Japan and the other was born in Sweden. At home, we use English and Japanese. So we have this big blend of languages, and language is a big part of my home life, certainly, but my professional life, and then trying to understand and navigate different school systems. And I think it's probably only my wife, Aki, who's Japanese, and me, who can understand some of the interesting sentences that our kids come up with by blending Swedish, English, and Japanese all together. So in any case, language use is always on my mind. When it comes to the courses that I teach, I work mostly with teacher education in Sweden. So the students that I typically teach want to be primary school, junior high, elementary school teachers within the Swedish school system. I also teach courses on English linguistics, usually with a pedagogic focus like classroom interaction or how teachers deal with typical English errors that students make. So really applied linguistics. And I also teach faculty development courses here at Stockholm University with titles like Teaching in English at University, where we consider issues related to that type of teaching in higher education. I have been involved in various EMI research projects. One project that's finished now related to student note-taking during lectures and their language use, whether they were taking notes in their first language or their second language, what kind of note-taking strategies they had to help them understand the content during lectures. A second project that I'm working on now focuses on lecturer speech in English and student comprehension of that speech. And really, there's a combination here of what the lecturer says, what the lecturer puts on PowerPoint slides, the kind of pre-lecture reading that students might do in preparation. So we look at the relationship between all of these forms of inputs within EMI and then try to understand what's helping students learn the content and how teachers might do more to support that student learning. I'm also involved in a cross-cultural project that examines policies, teaching practices, and student experiences in some European and some Asian countries in terms of EMI. And I'll be sharing some examples from that project with you a bit later. I also supervise PhD doctoral students who work on projects related to teacher education. And I just wanted to mention two of them because they are very closely related to EMI. One of the projects a student is working on relates to linguistic stereotyping and teacher bias based on their students' use of English. So if you think of, for instance, students with different English accents or different proficiency levels and the kind of judgments that a teacher might make about those students when listening to their English, this project tries to offset teacher bias related to English use. Another student works on a project about English reading ability of university students. And this project is set in Sweden. I would say that Sweden has a good reputation internationally in terms of English language proficiency. And yet we've found that at the end of high school, students have strong English listening and speaking abilities. But then there's this big gap between high school preparation in reading academic literature, and then the student enters university and they struggle to read academic literature in English. So this project really highlights the need for that specific skill, for support specifically for reading in English. So these are a few of the things that come across my desk every day, or that I think about, discuss with colleagues, and so on. That's a bit about me, but now I wonder, who are you? Of course, you know who you are, but let's try to get a sense of the group. From what I understand, you're university educators from a range of subjects and disciplines. Many of you are working at National Taiwan Normal University, but likely some other universities as well. So at this point, could I ask everyone to type in the chat two things? What discipline do you work in, and what university do you work at? Could we take a moment and type those two things in the chat? Thanks very much for sharing your areas of speciality and the universities that you've come from. So you've helped confirm my expectation that we have quite a range of sciences, social sciences, hard sciences, different types of business courses, and that you're coming from different universities. So this is great, a very diverse population in terms of subject and university. So more about you. This is my guess that this group has a range of confidence levels in terms of teaching in English, and also a range of English-related backgrounds. And by that, I mean, some of you likely studied in English-speaking countries at some point. Some of you may have traveled, spent study abroad sojourns in different places. Maybe you grew up in a household where English was used a lot. So we likely have a range of different experiences with English. You either are currently teaching in English, or you will be in the future, and are no doubt very excited about that prospect. I have to admit, since I am American, there might be some sarcastic comments that you're welcome to have a laugh at. And if you're not sure if I'm being sarcastic, you're welcome to ask. And then hopefully you're here because you're interested in improving your EMI knowledge and teaching practices. I'd like to think that that's the main goal of the whole lecture series. According to some policy documents about teaching in Taiwan, roughly 20% of faculty at universities have EMI teaching experience, and that 20% should equal around 7,000 faculty members in Taiwan who have this kind of experience. At the time of this document, this policy document, about 4.5% of all higher education in Taiwan is English medium instruction, but that number is likely going to rise very quickly in the near future. And these numbers come from the Bilingual 2030 policy document. So I've got a few more questions in the chat based on these numbers. First, in the chat, could you just type a yes or no, a Y or an N? Have you taught in English at university before? Yes or no, Y or N? So far, it looks like maybe 40 to 60%, about 40% saying, yes, you have some experience. That's great. And about 60% might be new to teaching in English at university. Hopefully for both groups, there's something that this series can offer. For those who already have experience, I'd hope to confirm what you're already doing, to increase your confidence that you're on the right track in your own teaching, and maybe pick up some new ideas. And for those who are new to teaching in English, that we get some understanding of what kind of expectations there might be, what kind of challenges and considerations we need to think about. My next question for the chat is another yes-no question, very easy questions, right? I mentioned this Bilingual 2030 policy document from the Taiwanese Ministry of Education. Have you read that document before? And again, it's a yes or no, Y or N. Have you read this document? And for those who have answered no, okay, or only part of it, fair enough. For those of you who have answered no, I'm sure this will be the first thing you read after we finish with today's session. That's a joke. That's a joke. But thanks for letting me know, because then I know how much assumed knowledge we have between the two of us. It seems like many of us are not so familiar with that document. That's no problem, because I'm going to highlight a few parts that I think are important for us to know as present and future EMI teachers. So thanks very much for those answers. So now we know who I am, we know who you are. Let's continue then with what is EMI? What is English medium instruction? Well, we could think of it as teaching in English, learning in English from the student perspective, using course literature in English. And you might think to yourself, does that count as teaching in English? in this first statement, teaching in English, what I mean is us as teachers using our voices, our spoken English to teach something. Then there's the student perspective, learning in English. Using course literature in English, well, then that's a teacher selecting a text in English and then expecting students to read that text and take some information from the text. We could also think of assessment, assessing content knowledge in English. Is that EMI? Giving feedback in English. So we as teachers telling students how to improve their work, praising them for what they've done well, criticizing student work where it needs to be criticized to improve. If we're doing those things in English, is that EMI? And what about interaction? Interacting with students, with other faculty in English, does that count as EMI? So we have all of these potential different aspects of English medium instruction. There's the word instruction in EMI, but one might think, it's not just instruction. There are several different aspects that are involved. And at this point, I'd like to try to use the polling feature. And Sonia, I'll give it a try myself and we'll see what happens. Okay, so this poll has been launched. So attendees, hopefully you can see a question. Which of these three do you think are the most important? So could you take a moment just to respond to that poll? Right.
Teachers,
I see that, and now I see the problem with my question that you're only able to select one instead of three. So maybe if you haven't answered already, pick the one that pops into your mind as the most important, as opposed to the three most important. Sorry about that. And can we take just one more minute to share your answers, either in the poll or in the chat? Either way works just fine. Right, all of the above. Very, very safe answer. So thanks very much for those responses and for considering these different aspects. My main point in asking this type of question is to help raise our awareness that it's not just our voice, not just the teaching parts speaking in English, but that there are other decisions that we make as teachers that are involved in EMI. So choosing course literature, making sure the literature is at an appropriate level for students so that they can get the knowledge we want them to get from the literature. Thinking about how we might support their reading in English, for instance. Many of you mentioned interacting in English. And so we would want to be able to have a friendly, open, good rapport with students, even if we're using English, which might be our second or an additional language, and the same for the students. That can be a challenge compared to interacting with students in a shared first language, where it might be easier to make jokes, to have some common ground. So these are some of the topics that we'll go into more detail as we go through the lecture series. So thanks for pointing out what you think are the important aspects. One last comment here is that if we picked learning in English as a priority, that of course that certainly should be a priority for teachers, learning in English. The learning part is not really something that we ourselves can do. Yes, we can learn in English, but what we can do, we can't learn for the student. We can make decisions about how we support their learning. Absolutely. And it's good that we can prioritize that aspect. So if you have heard of English medium instruction, for those who don't have much experience with EMI, hopefully now you get an idea that, oh, it's not really just what I say, but it's relates to all kinds of educational decisions. There are so many considerations when it comes to EMI. And if we answer yes to some of these questions, yes, interacting in English is EMI. Yes, choosing course literature is EMI. Yes, giving feedback in English is EMI. Well, then we have to think to ourselves, what adjustments might we make in comparison to when we teach in our first language that we're more comfortable in, when we're teaching students who we share a first language with? Well, now those situations have changed and we have to make certain adjustments. So we might think about adjusting our expectations, both for student learning and adjust our expectations for ourselves as teachers. It's hard to do our job in an additional language as well as we could do it in our first language. We might need to adjust the pace of our course. We might need to adjust the assignments that we give and the expectations we have about those assignments, and even the class organization. What are we going to do with our time together in an EMI class? Well, that organization might be different than if we were teaching a class in our first language. A main point here is that we can't just translate. We can't just translate our first language teaching or what we would do in our first language and simply translate to English or another additional language. We've got to make some kind of adjustments. So this is all led up to an introduction to talk number one, this lecture today, which I've titled How to Orient Yourself to EMI. Now I know a bit more about the audience, that some of you have some experience in EMI, many of you don't. Some of you are familiar with, for instance, the Bilingual 2030 policy documents, others of you not so much. So we want to try to orient ourselves to EMI and think about, what is my role as an EMI instructor? What should I be thinking about? What should I be aware of? And how should I be thinking about the student population, the groups of students and the individual students that are going to be in my EMI classes? That's what I mean about orient yourself. Like John Doe said earlier, change is not always easy. And it seems to me a logical beginning to facilitate some change is to make sure we're oriented with the topic that we're changing to. This how-to series includes 6 talks. We're here at talk number 1. Later, we'll talk about addressing challenges and considerations in EMI. Talk number 3 will be about implementing teaching strategies. Talk 4 about assessing and evaluating an EMI. And I already noted that some of you replied that this assessing content knowledge through English is an important part of EMI. Many of you mentioned that in the chat or the previous poll. Great. We're going to spend a whole session talking about that. We'll talk about inclusive practices and cultural aspects of EMI. And then in the last talk, we'll focus on best practices and look at some case studies of some kind of do's and don'ts, or things to try to promote and try to avoid in our own teaching. So hopefully that sounds like something that you signed up for. In terms of today, the goals that I hope we cover are considering definitions of EMI, thinking about EMI in your own context, and that relates to in Taiwan, in higher education, but also in your respective disciplines. And as we saw in the chat, there are a range of disciplines. I hope you understand different influencing factors related to EMI. We'll talk about some purposes and try to understand, or at least emphasize, the importance of EMI from certain perspectives, because it can be a controversial issue that not necessarily everyone thinks is a good idea. So at this point, I'd like to check in with you through a poll related to the pace of this session, the pace of this one-way lecturing from my side, and how much of the content you've understood. So if we take a look at the next polling question. So we'll end one poll and share the next poll. There's a question about the pace. So if you could just let me know what you think of the pace here.
Joe, can I have a quick question?
Please, go ahead.
You just mentioned that when we are conducting an EMI course, we must think about how to adjust the speed and also the content. Well, there's a huge debate in Taiwan talking about whether we would sacrifice some of the content or the progress that when it comes to EMI. You can choose to answer this question now or later.
Okay.
Up to you. What do you say when we are adjusting? Then what might be the like heads up that we need to know, and then what might be the strategies that we can employ so that these debates that we're having can be solved with a win-win situation.
Thanks for bringing it up. I won't answer it on the spot because I'm worried that I won't be able to give a well thought out answer. But I've made a note, and certainly something that we'll bring up in a future session. Does that sound fair enough?
Thank you very much.
Yep. And based on this poll, it looks like everyone's relatively comfortable. Okay, great. Then I'll just end that poll, and we'll carry on with roughly this pace. But if at any time you think this is going too fast, you're welcome to just let me know, put something in the chat, and we can adjust as needed. But based on these responses, we'll just carry on. So we'll get to some more of the main content defining EMI. What is EMI? And I'd like to share a few technical definitions that come from the research literature. Here's one. EMI is the use of the English language to teach academic subjects in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. And Nicola Galloway says that this is among the most commonly cited definitions. And what I notice is in bold here, this is a content-focused definition because of the teach academic subjects. Teach academic subjects. Okay, that doesn't mention language development or language ability at all. It's focused on teaching the content through English. If we look at a different definition, this is from Naoko Taguchi, a scholar a Japanese scholar who works in the US. She uses the term English medium education as opposed to the EMI instruction that we're using. And some scholars call what we're talking about English medium education to acknowledge the relation between teaching and learning, not just the one-way instruction from the teacher. So it's another term that you might encounter. But she calls English medium education curricula using English as a medium of instruction for basic and advanced courses to improve students' academic English proficiency. So my comment in bold here, this is language. Now language is included to improve students' academic English proficiency. So you can see two different kinds of priorities based on these definitions. Is it just content, or is it content plus language? In Taiwan, from this bilingual 2030 document, an English medium of instruction course of study is when an academic subject is taught through the medium of English. So you could ask yourself, is the Taiwanese Ministry of Education's definition more content-focused or language-focused? Academic subject, academic subject. And so hopefully you think, that's more content-focused. At least that's the way it seems to me. And what does that mean? If the focus is on content, that assumes that the students already have the academic English proficiency to handle the content. We know in reality that's probably not always the case, and that as EMI teachers, we need to make special adjustments and concessions, just like what Dr. Fawn mentioned earlier about speed versus amount of content and so on, a very important question. Here's another definition of EMI, and this comes from two of my colleagues in Sweden, Diane Pekarari and Hans Malmström. EMI is where English is the language used for instructional purposes when teaching content subjects, although not itself the subject being taught, and also a second or additional language for most participants in the setting. And that's an important last clause. It's a second or additional language for most participants. That could be the teacher, that could be all of the students, some of the students. So it broadens the definition in some ways. This definition opens up for EMI to exist in predominantly English-speaking countries as well. So there could be EMI in the UK or Canada, for instance. It doesn't necessarily have to take place in a country where English is not spoken regularly. So this definition continues to evolve. I'd like to move on to introduce a few key terms related to EMI and focus at this point on different forms of EMI. So there could be single medium, where all major content subjects, apart from foreign languages, are taught in English. So maybe, say, a department or an entire university does everything in English. There are no other options. It's English or nothing. That would be single medium. A second form is dual medium or partial EMI, where some subjects, again, within a department or a program or a university, some subjects are taught in English and some in another language, that probably being the local language. There could be parallel EMI, where the same subject is taught in two languages. So just as an example, in Sweden, the same subject might be taught in Swedish for local students or domestic students, and then an English stream for international students who don't have the Swedish ability. This kind of parallel EMI also occurs in places like Italy, where a subject is taught in Italian for local students and in English for international students. And there are certainly more types of forms of EMI, but just to mention a few, you might think to yourself, okay, what is my department like? What is my university like? Which of these forms are we using? Since we know that EMI is a big change in Taiwan, I wanted to introduce some different types of change that are mentioned in the literature. And these types of change, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, come from an EMI handbook that was produced in Europe by the Erasmus Plus project. So one type of change could be the change of language, moving from the local language of instruction to English. So just changing from the first language to English. The same materials are used with the same types of students. The only change is literally the language. A different type of change has the asterisk here. Change of language, yes, plus change of teaching style. And I think this is what would describe the situation in Taiwan the best. We're changing language, yes, And we also should consider changing teaching style for the benefit of the students and really for the benefit of the teacher as well. So here the setting and the students remain the same, but it's not only the language that changes, but the teaching style as well. And when we, as our group, get to our talks 2, 3, 4, we'll be talking about some of those changes to the teaching style. Another important thing to consider in relation to our students is understanding where they're coming from in terms of their English ability and their experience in interacting with English as an academic language. So this key term relates to start time. We could have early EMI that begins in pre-elementary or elementary school and continues all the way to higher education. So a student with early EMI would be very accustomed to working with academic texts, using English as an academic language, even from their early years. They would have lots of experience and likely be well prepared by the time they get to university to continue working with EMI. The middle start time is considered to be secondary or high school. That's when EMI might start and then continues to higher education. So there's some kind of preparation in the secondary high school years, the early teenage years, with the intent of preparing students for higher education in English. That middle start time, they would have less time, less experience than the early EMI group. And then finally, we have the late starters. Late start, where EMI occurs only in higher education. And that can be the most challenging for students because they've spent their academic careers working in their first language or a language they're very comfortable in, and then suddenly they come to university and now everything switches to English. That means that reading, writing, listening, speaking all might take more time. They might have less confidence and so on. So you might think about the student groups that you teach or will teach. Which of these 3 start times would they fall within? If we knew that we had a whole course or a whole group of early EMI starters, well, then we would know we can probably increase the pace. We know that they're used to EMI and have a lot of experience. Whereas the late starters might need more explicit support. We as teachers might need to be more patient to set realistic expectations for students at that late stage. So I hope you can take some of these key terms and think about them in relation to your own context and start to appreciate the different pedagogic choices that you might make as teachers based on what you know about the students. Before we take a break, I'd just like to emphasize 4 key features of EMI. Now we've talked about different start times, different forms of EMI, and so on. These are 4 key features of EMI. And for those of you who already have experience teaching, you might recognize these. For those of you who are new to EMI, these are things that you really want to keep in mind, I would say, as some cornerstones for successful English medium instruction. In practice, 4 features differentiate EMI from other modes of instruction in English. First, learning is focused on content, not language. Learning is focused on content, not language. If we think back to those definitions, it's the content. Number 2, English should be used most of the time for teachers and students. English should be used most of the time. Notice that does not say all of the time, most of the time. And we'll talk about the benefits of translanguaging or code switching at certain times as a strategy for teachers. Number 3, other languages may be used in a limited way to ensure understanding. So for instance, if you needed to translate a certain term or concept into the student's first language to make sure they understand the concept, and then use the English terminology so that they can connect those two. That would be using other languages in a limited way. And finally, EMI pedagogy is used to support students' language needs. In other words, we as EMI teachers need to recognize that there are certain things we can do to make student learning easier, to relieve anxiety that they might have, while still emphasizing the content that we want them to learn, the specific disciplinary concepts, terminology, skills that they need to know, that we can take certain actions and make certain decisions to support them as they're learning content through English. And we'll be revisiting and expanding on these as the lecture series continues. I'd like to continue by talking about various players who are involved in EMI. And researchers in this area have outlined some important stakeholders, excuse me, that we should pay attention to from a recent paper, including colleagues in China and Sweden. There are questions for EMI administrators, instructors, and students. So we should think about EMI at these 3 different levels. There's an institutional level, there's a classroom or departmental level, and then focused on groups of students and individual students themselves. And in this particular paper, there's a long list of questions for each of these 3 levels, but I just wanted to share some samples of those questions. For instance, for administrators, a question that should be considered is, how is language competency for EMI defined and standardized? In other words, what are the entry requirements for a program or a course in terms of English proficiency? That's an admin type question, a framework type question. An example of an instructor question: what resources are available to improve EMI teaching or to make for effective EMI teaching? In your case right now, you might say a workshop or a lecture like this and other types of resources that acknowledge that teaching in EMI is not the same as teaching in one's first language. So I hope you see this particular talk as a resource and also look for others in your respective universities. And then a question for students. Students might need to reflect on a question like this. In what kind of professional situations will I use English after I graduate? And hopefully students have an answer to that question, because that would help their motivation for studying in EMI. That could help justify them enrolling in an EMI program. So this is one paper that outlines several questions at these different levels. Another framework that can help us understand EMI context comes from some colleagues who work in Austria and Southern Europe. And they have a road mapping framework, a framework that they've dubbed road mapping. And each of these letters stands for something. The road mapping acknowledges the roles of English in society beyond the educational context. It acknowledges English being different in different academic disciplines. Different academic disciplines have different expectations, different needs for English. You might think to yourself that natural sciences compared to social sciences, compared to humanities, well, each of those broad areas have different expectations and needs when it comes to English. Then we have management, and that relates to language management, the policies an institution might set. There are different agents, and those agents could be administrators, teachers, course designers, students, and so on. There are practices and processes, in other words, what happens in the classroom. And then EMI is both something that's international, but also something that's global in their terms, globalization, that there's some relation between EMI practices in other places that can help inform our own local situation. So this road mapping idea helps us understand how EMI fits in our particular context, very broadly outside of education and then inside the institution at various levels. I mentioned earlier that I'm involved in a joint European-Asian project focused on comparing how things work related to EMI in both places. And I wanted to share a few findings. One related to policies, if we think of frameworks and structures. In terms of this road mapping idea, policies can be both written and unwritten. And in Defoe's and Smith's road mapping, the roles of English relate to societal roles. So if you think of the functions of English outside the institution and consider what the language of the environment is, the language of society, is it English or not English, or is English used sometime in society? Well, that might relate to how English is taught or used in the university. Then there's also an institutional role of English. The language as a subject itself, learning English as the subject, the use of English for internal, external communication. So you might think of whether within a department who uses EMI, when we communicate with our colleagues, do we need to use English or can we use a shared first language? When we send emails to students or messages, is it in English or in a shared first language? That would be an institutional role of English. In relation to this joint project that I mentioned, these are some of the things that came up in our discussions with EMI teachers, EMI coordinators in various places at various levels. In terms of societal roles, you might consider government documents, the legal status of language or languages. For instance, is English an official language? Are there multiple official languages in a certain country? For instance, in Sweden, Swedish is an official language, and there are other minority languages that are recognized legally as official languages. English is not. And yet, English is very present in society. There's lots of English media coverage. TV shows, movies are dubbed in English. There's no subtitles. So those things can affect us as teachers and our students when they get to university. In society, there are some court rulings related to English in different countries. And we could think of the purpose of English use. Is it for economic use, employability, for social use among social circles? Then if we think of institutional use, well, how does English show up in curriculum documents? Is English specifically stated as a language of instruction? Is there a choice between English and the first language? Are there different funding resources? Does the university put money behind the idea of EMI to support students and teachers? And are there English support systems for both groups, the teachers and the students? And we could also add administrators there in terms of English support systems. Do administrators understand what it means to be part of an EMI program? Do they understand incoming students and their English proficiency, their English needs? So in relation to these kind of policies, I'd like to ask for your input in the chat. And I notice a typo on my slide here. It should say, does your department or university have implicit or explicit policies related to English use? Does your department have policies? If so, are they implicit or explicit? Does the university have policies, implicit or explicit? So I'd like to pause there just for a moment to ask you to just drop your ideas in the chat. With a mixture of teachers from different disciplines, different departments, different universities, it's no wonder that we see a few different answers in the chat. For those who say no, I would encourage you to start thinking about, is there some kind of implicit understanding? Maybe not, but maybe there are, and these policies or practices, expectations might not be articulated, they might not be written down somewhere, but there actually might be some kind of implicit practices going on. And all of us might be involved in the future in making these explicit policies. If these big changes related to EMI are coming, then people like us might be involved in setting the policies, or at least contributing our perspectives. And hopefully after today, after our lecture series, after reflecting on these topics, then you will have something to contribute to the policies, either setting patterns for the implicit policies, the unwritten ones, or contributing to how the language is formulated in the actual written policies. So I wanted to just to bring those up, and thanks for sharing your answers. It gives me a better understanding of the current situation there, but good for all of us, myself included, to remember that there are typically some explicit policies. If there aren't yet, there probably will be as EMI becomes more prominent in Taiwan, but there might already be implicit policies, expectations that we should try to be aware of. So these are a few points related to the policies and the general framework. We need to understand those things to understand our role. How do we fit in an EMI program? What's expected of us? And what's going on around us as well. Let's move on then to talk a bit about the people and focus on who they are. In that road mapping idea, there was the word agents. And agents are defined as different social players at diverse socio-political, institutional, and hierarchical levels. They may adopt different roles based on status within an organization, professional concerns, and/or English proficiency. So here, this idea of agents represents a few different levels, and you could think of administrators, deans, course coordinators, classroom teachers, students, even the students' parents, media coverage of how EMI is going, agents at lots of different levels. In terms of our joint project, we really wanted to focus on the end users of EMI, the students and teachers, the people who are intimately engaged in EMI on a daily basis. And from our discussions, these bullet points came up. Understanding teachers and students' linguistic backgrounds, their educational backgrounds more generally, and that could include early, middle, late starters in EMI, motivations for being involved in EMI, the emotions that we might feel from the teacher side, needing to teach in a language that we might not be fully confident or comfortable in, at least compared to our first language. In fact, some teachers might feel some resistance or frustration at being forced to teach in English. I'm sure no one here feels that, but teachers in other places might. And then, of course, students are going to have some emotions about feeling anxiety, pressure, challenges to learn in a language that they might not be fully confident in. And then, of course, agents, users need to make decisions. For us as teachers, it's pedagogical decisions. What are we going to do in the classroom? And for students, they'll be making decisions, strategic decisions about how they can keep up with an EMI course. How can they learn from it, even though it's not in their first language? So important to consider the different people. And in future lectures, we'll talk in more detail about each of these points. There are also some general contextual considerations that we might think about. And I just wanted to use a recent project that I got involved with as an example from Sri Lanka, where after a civil war, universities are trying to find ways to even out university education and make it accessible to a broader range of the population following a civil war where certain groups might feel some animosity to groups who use certain first languages or languages from different regions. And when they come to the university, some institutions want to reduce any kind of anxiety or negative connotations attached to a certain dialect or a certain regional language. And so they're trying to introduce English as a way to neutralize those kind of feelings. So we can ask ourselves questions on the international stage. Can EMI increase fairness and inclusion? Well, in Sri Lanka's case, for this initiative, I think they would answer yes to this. They're trying to institute this, that using English at university can increase inclusion, increase feelings of safety. The project is still ongoing, so there are no real answers, but EMI has been considered as a possible tool to do something like this. So since the break, I've tried to introduce these different frameworks about how we can think of EMI, broad societal perspectives about the roles of English, and then also focused on the individuals who are involved on a daily basis in EMI. Let's shift gears a bit to talk about the goals of EMI. And these goals are expressed as what many countries, institutions would feel are reasons why we should be implementing EMI. The first is to provide a common language of instruction in countries with multilingual populations. So an example there would be Sri Lanka, a multilingual population. Maybe we can use English to make things more democratic and equal. The second, to develop the skills needed to use English as an academic lingua franca with so much knowledge, textbooks, research articles being published, conferences as well being held in English. Well, English is an access to this academic content. Number three, to enable institutions to attract international students, to enable students to study in an English medium university without the expense of traveling to an Anglophone country. So in other words, a student could study in their home country in English without paying for a study abroad situation. Number five, EMI can increase the prestige of an institution. It can promote economic competitiveness through developing a proficient English workforce. It can produce graduates with global literacy skills, assuming that one has worked with different languages in a multicultural class with teachers from various backgrounds, for instance. And then finally, number eight, to facilitate regional and international communication. So we have a number of different goals here. I'd like to ask for your input in a poll about which of these goals do you think is most important? And so I'll launch a poll here to ask you just to tick one of those goals. Let's see what we collectively think. Let's just take one more minute for a few more responses. From what I can see, there's a pretty equal balance between the idea of developing skills for academic English, access to academic English, and then also number 8, to help regional and international communication. As I said, these are goals that are expressed internationally, that a collection of different goals for EMI. And when I look at this list, I see some that are very much related to education, language of instruction, academic lingua franca. Those to me seem education focused. When I look at the middle 3, I think about money. There's prestige, attracting international students, and I see money signs from the university's perspective anyway. And then being able to study in the home country without traveling to an Anglophone country, well, then there's the idea of saving money. So there's some kind of immediate economic, money-driven reasons. Of course, these might differ depending on the university, but in general, internationally speaking, this is certainly a concern for at least some schools. And then the third set relates more to the future. Okay, what do we want our students to be able to do? So really, these broad goals cover education, financial reasons, and then promoting a strong workforce, facilitating communication. But my point here is that there are a range of goals and a range of reasons. And some of these goals might be more or less applicable to one's national situation, or a certain university, or even a certain department. It's really hard to deny that EMI is a widespread and global trend. Nicola Galloway says that the growth of EMI around the globe is exponential, and now Taiwan is certainly part of that growth. We can see that global trend in works like these different books. Language in Use in EMI at University has chapters from several different continents. The Practice of EMI Around the World, again, descriptions of EMI in lots of different places. The reports on EMI, CLIL, and bridging programs in higher education in Asia. So we can see EMI being represented in bottom-up ways and described from top-down perspectives as well. Top-down perspective being, how does the institution implement EMI? What are the regulations? What are the university's goals? And then from the bottom up, what are we trying to do for the students and teachers to be able to work within EMI? And this next slide emphasizes that global trend. If you just look at the first line, as far back as 10 years ago, EMI was used at 90% of private universities. This is globally, and more than 75% of public universities. So it's going on everywhere and at both public and private institutions. We also see books like this one the Routledge Handbook of English Medium Instruction in Higher Education, and this was just published in 2024. So brand new, hot off the press. This is a topic that lots of people are interested in. And it is a trend, yes, but it's not a trend without controversy. And I just list a few examples here about potential controversy. Court cases, for example, in Italy, some departments and universities have sued the government because they don't want to teach in English. So they've taken that to the Supreme Court. There can be resistance at different institutional levels. Maybe some department wants to resist EMI. There can be societal concerns. If we're teaching in English and emphasizing English so much, then there might be threats to official languages. In Sweden, there's a discussion about English growing in academic communities, which means Swedish is being minimized. So English grows at the expense of Swedish. That can be a concern. We as teachers need to think about the availability of textbooks, articles, and so on in English as opposed to in different languages. And then there are certainly disciplinary differences about the need for English. Again, if we think just broadly of natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities, well, there are likely differences in terms of which disciplines rely on English more for communication. Here I share a recent book that was published in Sweden, and the title is På engelska förstår jag ungefär. And I'm going to assume that there aren't many Swedish users in our audience. På engelska förstår jag ungefär means in English, I understand approximately, or I kind of understand. And in Sweden, we have lots of EMI, but there are also books like this written by 2 university professors who say, we don't want to teach in English anymore because the students understand to a degree, but they don't understand as well as they would in their first language. So my point here is that EMI can be controversial, and it's not necessarily a topic that everyone agrees on. I'd like to move on to focus on what is L2, and by L2 I mean second language. What is second language English? We often say someone speaks another language. It's always speak, speak, speak. I speak English. Do you speak English? And I wonder, why is the emphasis on speaking? Do you speak Korean? I speak Swahili. I wish I could speak French. Do you recognize this? Speak, speak, speak. But a language involves more than speaking. There are receptive skills, listening and reading, productive skills, speaking and writing, a knowledge of linguistic systems, vocabulary, phonics, phonetics, the sounds, the grammar. There's pragmatic competence, and so on. So it's not just speaking. And our language proficiency is crucial, both ours and our students. We need to understand student proficiency levels so we can know how to pace our classes, support student needs, assess students' content knowledge, select materials if we think about selecting readings, selecting videos to show, and then also in terms of our own production and our own interactions. If you think back to when we started, interacting in English is an important part of EMI. So thinking of proficiency, I'd like to ask for your input about your own English proficiency. And the next poll asks a question. Which English skill do you think is your strongest, you personally? And remember, there are no names attached to the answers, but what would you say is your strongest skill in English? And so far, we've got just over 20 votes out of 60 or so. So we'll wait a minute for everyone else to pick one of the 4 skills. So far, it looks like most of us consider reading our strongest skill. And to me, that's not really a surprise. When we read, we get to set the pace. We can go back and reread a text. We can use translation software. We can use a dictionary. So we have a lot of control when we're reading. When it comes to speaking, well, then there are a lot of risks with speaking. Someone might not like our accent. We have to formulate our thoughts very quickly before we produce them. So there can be lots of pressure when it comes to speaking. The reason I ask this question is that it's important for us as teachers to understand our own proficiency. If I'm a strong reader in English, that's of course great. It also doesn't necessarily mean that the students are strong English readers. Or if listening in English is easy for me, that doesn't necessarily mean listening is easy for my students. So we want to have some awareness of our own skills in English compared to what our students' abilities are, which is why I asked this question. So thanks for sharing your ideas there. On the topic of proficiency, one way of measuring proficiency is to use a system called the Common European Framework for Reference of Languages. And the nickname for that, or abbreviation, is CEFR, C-E-F-R. And it's a way of measuring proficiency, ranging from A1 level, which would be very basic, to C2 level, which would be a proficient native-like user, and moving through these intermediate stages of the B1, B2. Are you familiar with this CEFR scale? Could I ask you just to type a yes or no in the chat? Have you heard of this idea, CEFR, and these CEFR scales? If you haven't yet heard of them, no problem. In our next session, we'll take a closer look at the CEFR scale and look at some examples of the descriptions and what we might expect our students to be able to do in English. So thanks for letting me know. That's helpful information for me to plan our next session. And of course, in relation to proficiency, we can think about how we implement EMI and be aware of practical issues. We've had some initial thoughts today, but we'll certainly have more in-depth ideas related to proficiency later in the series. As we wind down, I want to highlight a few things from the Bilingual 2030 policy document, since I'm sure during the 10-minute break, you didn't have a chance to revisit or to read that document. So the idea with EMI in Taiwan, according to this policy document, is to enhance young people's English communication capabilities, to enhance their professional expertise and skills, to increase their global competitiveness so that they can enjoy better job and salary opportunities. There's that future forward-looking aspect of EMI, and that they can communicate and collaborate with counterparts from other countries. So these goals, initiatives are certainly in line with the international scene. A few highlights from research from Taiwanese students. They believe that EMI can help them acquire English proficiency and intercultural skills, develop social networks, increase their motivation for studying in their discipline, can improve language skills, especially receptive skills, in other words, listening and reading, and provide access to discipline-specific terminology and academic discourse in English. So there's that English as a lingua franca in academia. So students recognize these potential. When we think of EMI in Taiwan in relation to CEFR, again, according to the Bilingual 2030 document, about 20% of grade 12 students have reached a B2 level. And if you're not sure what that means, we'll revisit this next time. But there's considerable unevenness when we think of the 4 language skills: listening, reading, speaking, writing. And Taiwanese students tend to be better in the receptive skills, just like how you reported, more stronger skills in reading and listening, and less confidence in productive skills of speaking and writing. So that's in line with the research. In other words, according to this policy document, although students with a good English level will not experience major problems with reading English textbooks or listening to English instruction, many of them being Taiwanese university students, many of them will encounter difficulties in writing English reports or participating in classroom discussions. And so that's an important idea for us as teachers. If we can assume their reading and listening skills are strong in general, we need to support those to an extent, but we definitely need to spend time supporting writing, classroom discussion, speaking English. And those are topics that we will definitely take up in the next 2 sessions. So a bit of a preview there. So it's about time for us to wind down. You've had a long day, I'm sure. So I just want to review the goals for today and hope that you can mentally check these off, that we have covered these to an extent. We've considered definitions of EMI. We've thought about EMI in your own context. Started to understand some influencing factors like proficiency. We've talked about some purposes for EMI and hopefully understand its importance in the present for learning and then in the future for economic and job prospects. And now we have some idea that EMI is not just what the teacher says, but that there are many different aspects, course literature, feedback, interaction, and so on, that we'll be spending more time on later in the series. Before we finish, I'd like to ask for a quick response to one last poll to help me understand better how things went today. So I've got a question about this particular session. How useful was this session for you? And again, remember the responses don't have your name tied to them. It's anonymous. Please let me know. That'll help me think about what we do next time. You're welcome to continue responding to the poll if you haven't already. I'll just continue rounding off, thinking about our next session in 2 weeks from now, where we'll be talking about considerations and challenges related to EMI. And we'll be thinking about challenges in general, talking about the teacher's role in EMI, and also making sure that we attend to the student perspective of operating in English medium instruction. I have a list of what I would consider some useful references that I drew on for this particular session. And I assume that I can send a set of slides to the session organizers who could then share them with you. Or of course, you could take a screenshot of this yourself, but we'll try to make this list and all the other slides available to you so you can reflect on those. And finally, as part of the English language specialist programs, you can always find out more information about other programs going on by visiting these different social media sites. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and say thank you very much. I really enjoyed meeting you, finding out more about you, and thinking ahead to our next meeting in 2 weeks. I'll stop talking and turn it over to the organizers if there are any final words.
Thank you, Professor Siegel, for your wonderful presentation, expliciting highlight the needs of considerations when it comes to EMI. To have a comprehensive understanding, we must understand it's not just about the teacher's language translation, and there are so many things that we need to consider. Back to the question I've asked, I look forward to your future session. I think those sessions will be answering the question one by one. And I think that these are the challenge ahead, especially when it comes to not only with pedagogical content knowledge that teachers should apply in their teaching design, instructional design, but also a kind of understanding in terms of students' language proficiency in 4 skills. Although teachers are not language teacher, although EMI based on the assumption that students are capable to deploy those skills in the target language. However, as you just mentioned, this is not always the reality. So I think that if, like you just talked about CEFR, it actually comes with a long list of can-do statements, and it comes with a bandwidth that students may have a ranking in CEFR, but how do teachers apply those can-do statements to their classes is also something that if that can be discussed later, that would be very helpful. And today, I just want to say that I enjoyed the session so much. It is just not only that we got a comprehensive understanding about how EMI should be like, but also with a policy as the framework that we look into. I'm very surprised and very happy to see that Professor Siegel, as a not an educator in Taiwan, right, but try to look at it in this framework. And I think that is the most effective way to do so. Thank you very much. And I agree that all the participants, as they left their message in the chat box, they all learn a lot from this session, and we all look forward to the coming one. Thank you very much, Professor Siegel, and thank you, Jenny.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Jenny, I'll leave it to you.
We just look forward to the next session. Thank you for today.
Fair
and thank
enough.
you everyone for your time.
Okay, thanks very much. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. So we'll say goodbye for now.
Take
care.
You. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. See you.
Thank you.
Professor Siegel, do you think that the poll function suit to your needs today?
Yeah, it worked. I think it worked well. It's as long as you think it worked well from your side. Since I'm not sure what the audience members can see, assuming that you saw what you expected at the right time, then I think it worked fine.
We will gather their answers and then send it back to you so that you can proceed with the research as well, and also get a copy of what they just answered with those.
Sure. Okay. Sounds good. And if you think of about this session and how it went in terms of the contents, the pace, the interaction, the polls and things, and you can let me know if you'd like me to plan to continue like this, or if you'd like something changed. I'm certainly open to hearing what you think, or if you get feedback from other participants about that, you can pass it on so I can factor it into the next session.
Sure. I think that with a quick check about your pace and about the content that you just deliver is a very useful strategy, especially in EMI instructions. And to those instructors, I noticed that not like 1/3 of them are EMI practitioners, and 2/3 of them seems to be new to EMI. I'm thinking about why don't you? Well, just a quick suggestion. Why don't you just explicitly show the participants says that this might also be a strategy that you can use in EMI classroom, as your class today is actually a demonstration of EMI courses.
Yep.
Well,
Okay.
in my view. Right.
I can certainly do that.
That would be great. Because I don't want them just to feel that today is also another compilation of knowledge, so that to enlighten them with the EMI theories, but you are also putting those into practice with a very demonstrative way, right? Like the poll, like the interaction. Students can respond to this without even saying things, right? They can read,
Yeah.
they can click, and that
Mhm.
actually lower down their anxiety and
Yeah.
give them more chances to interact. Those are the things that you do.
That's a very good point. I can certainly make that explicit.
Yes. And other than that, I think everything's perfect.
Okay, glad to hear. I can see one participant has a hand up. If that,
That's a Taiwanese style of thank you and goodbye.
is it? Okay. You're welcome and goodbye.
Well, every time, yes, yes, every time when you're trying to ask them whether they think it's okay, and they will say they rather than doing the round applause, they raise their hand. Or maybe
Okay.
not this time. Let's ask him. Professor Li Yuchen, are you here? Well, I assume just the round applause.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. But thanks for letting me know. Now my cultural knowledge has increased as well. Yeah. So I'm happy to be in touch by email before our next session, but look forward to that. And I can send you the slides. And would you be able to share them with the participants through the sign-up list?
Yes, we could.
Or some other way?
Sure. We have their access.
Yeah. Okay. Then I will do that in the near future,
Sure.
if that's all right.
So we will be compiling. The first thing is the recording of the meeting link. The second thing is the result of the poll, and then we will try to gather their feedback through the chat box in a neat way, because it can be very messy, but we will try to do that to analyze if there are some questions that can further be addressed.
Okay. Yep. Sounds good. Okay.
Wonderful.
Well, thanks very much for a smooth session, at least from my side.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you,
We'll be in
Professor
touch.
Chico. Thank you.
Okay, take
Thank
care.
you. Have a great
Bye.
day. Bye.
You too. Bye.